year was 1535, and French Breton captain Jaques Cartier would set sail from France on his second voyage to Canada. His mission was to find the Northwest Passage and a lucrative trade route to Asia. On this voyage, he would sail down the St. Lawrence River, thinking that it would lead to Asia. On encountering some impassable rapids, he decided to stay and overwinter in the Iroquois capital of Stadacona. Before long, his three ships, the Grande Hermine, the Petite Hermine and the Emerillon, carrying 110 souls, would be stuck in over a fathom of ice. The crew tried to prepare for winter by gathering as much firewood as they could and salting game and any meat they could find. However, soon enough, scurvy broke out amongst the ranks. It was said that out of the 110 souls, only 10 were able to get up and help one another. The situation was getting worse aboard the three ships, and Cartier inquired to the local Iroquois if they knew any medicinal intervention. The Iroquois told them of a concoction made from the needles and the inner bark of a tree. The scurvy was completely cured. It was miraculous. Cartier said it was a godsend. The tea and concoction in question was the famous pine needle tea. Thanks to the Iroquois and the Oneida, the Tree of Life, 85 out of those 110 souls would survive. It's still debated today which particular conifer the Oneida was, but it's thought it's probably the eastern white pine. Pine needle teas have been used throughout the world as medicine and also enjoyed as a forest drink. Today we're going to have a look at pine needle tea, which conifers are safe and which ones are poisonous, and also how to prepare it and some of the medicinal benefits as well. Now, most conifers can be used to make needle tea: firs, spruce or pines. There are, however, a couple of poisonous varieties which we'll go over later. It's easy to tell your spruce from your fir from your pine because of the needles. Remember this adage: spruce square, fir flat, and pine always has multiple needles coming from the same sheath. Pine can have 2 to 5 needles coming from the same sheath. This particular tree here is a spruce, and it was a result of a plantation to help the Napoleonic War effort. We can tell it's a spruce because it has a square needle in cross section. Now, if we have a closer look at these spruce needles, we can tell it's a spruce because the needles have a square cross section and will roll between your fingers like this. Whereas the fir needles will be flat and the pines will have multiple needles coming from the same sheath. Here in Scotland, our equivalent of the Iroquois Tree of Life or Oneida is the Pinus sylvestris, better known as the Scots Pine. It's been used by northern European cultures such as the Sami for thousands of years as a forest drink and a medicinal cure. Behind me here is a beautiful stand of old Scots pine trees, so let's get out the wind and go and take a closer look at them. We haven't really had that much snow this winter, but we've had an abundance of wind, and unfortunately this majestic spruce came down in the famous Storm Arwen a few months ago. It's not been a great year for the conifers. Here we've reached the heart of the forest amongst these beautiful mature Scots pine. It really does feel like a natural cathedral. Scots pine will often reach up to 40 to 45 metres in height and have a trunk diameter of around 1 metre. In Estonia, they've got a record breaker at 46 meters high. When identifying a Scots pine tree, the first thing I always look for is its characteristic orangey brown bark that scales off a little bit like the texture of puff pastry. The second notable characteristic of the Scots pine are its needles. If you look closely at the needles, you'll see that on the Scots pine, two needles actually erupt from the same sheath. So if we pull these grouping of needles off at the sheath here, we'll see that they are in fact joined. So Scots pine always has two needles coming from the same sheath. Pines can have up to 5 needles sprouting from the same sheath, whereas spruce and fir trees will only have 1 needle. So why not have a look in your area and see which pines you have native and which might be good for selecting for your pine needle tea. Now before going to pick needles to make your pine needle tea, I would ask you to familiarise yourself with a couple of the toxic and poisonous varieties of conifer out there. Most notably the yew tree. The yew tree has red berries and also toxic needles. You'll see it in places like churchyards and hedgerows. Make sure you have a good look at images of the yew tree before you go out hunting for pine needles. Also stay away from using juniper needles, cypress, ponderosa pine, Monterey pine, lodgepole pine and balsam fir, because these also purportedly contain toxic compounds which would be very bad if you ingested them as pine needle tea. If it's that pure vitamin C content you're looking for in your pine needle tea, you should go for the older, more mature needles. There was a study that showed that the older needles contained as much as 3.5 times the vitamin C as the younger needles do. It's quite hard to completely positively date the needles, but go for length and you'll notice when they're older they do get longer and they become a little bit more inflexible. So I'm going to select some of those older needles because it is still winter here and I think I need as much vitamin C as possible, and I also quite like that kind of turpentine-y resinous pine flavour. I'm just going to gently take the twin needles in their sheath and just pull backwards and it'll pop them off without damaging the branch. I like to vary where I collect and gather the needles from on the tree, so we're not going to have too much of a negative impact on its photosynthesis in any particular spot. That's more than enough needles there for our tea. Let's go get these chopped up and prepared. Now in order to keep the highest amount of vitamin C as possible, you don't want to boil your tea too aggressively. You want to try and keep it on that low kind of simmer. Unfortunately in my camping kettle it's kind of a wee bit difficult to modulate it, so I'm just going to boil the tea today. Whilst it's heating up there, I might go and find a little bit of inner bark of the Scots pine to add to the concoction. Instead of damaging a living whole tree, why don't you look for a fallen branch like this that's fresh and was alive when it fell, and we'll try and harvest some inner bark from this. So I'm going to carefully remove the outer bark. I'm going to try and get to that lighter coloured pithy bark underneath here. Here we go. So let's take a few little strips of this with us. So do you see the beginning of the sapwood there? And we're just taking that white coating off underneath. Trying not to get any wood. And then just cut it off. It's very soft and malleable. Kind of feels a bit like kind of rubbery, almost like chewing gum. Some people are known just to eat this off the tree, and I believe other native cultures around the world would pulverize it into a kind of flour, or even roast it a little bit like bacon. We can try a wee bit and see what it's like. It's actually quite nice. It's quite sweet, quite piney. A little bit of a kind of ginger or lemongrass type kick to it. Definitely eat it if I was starving. Quite bitter though. I believe in summer, if you harvest it as opposed to winter as we are now, it will have more starch and sugar content and probably be a bit sweeter. Pine needle tea, often with the addition of the bark, has been used around the world to bolster vitamin C levels in the winter and help to fight against scurvy. The scurvy is a condition you get which creeps up on you when you have a very low level of vitamin C in your body. Alongside vitamin C in the pine needle tea, you also get vitamin A, and with the addition of the bark, you can add a few amino acids such as arginine. That's quite interesting because arginine is a kind of vasodilator and it can expand blood vessels. Thus, I suppose it would help the vitamins get shuttled around the body very efficiently. Perhaps that's why the crew of Jaques Cartier's voyage to Canada recovered so quickly in about 8 days of these terrible scurvy-like symptoms, where they had swollen joints and kind of rotting gums and loose teeth and skin lesions and all this horrible stuff. It's quite hard to imagine them getting better so fast, but maybe this tonic is incredibly powerful when you have scurvy. Certainly I've never had scurvy and don't intend to, and hopefully keep it away with this tonic we're making just now. So in terms of boiling time, that's really up to you. The longer you boil it for, the more of that kind of greeny, piney, turpentine flavour is going to come out. And likewise, a gentle simmer and a lower time is going to yield a slightly more green and kind of not so turpentine-y type tea. All of its medicinal and scurvy fighting properties aside, it's just a lovely drink to be enjoyed in the forest at any time of year, summer or winter. It's particularly nice now with the snow still on the ground and the kind of the lure of spring around the corner, with those daffodils and snowdrops beginning to make an appearance. In terms of the flavour of the tea, it's got the kind of dry, piney top notes, woodsy, think of like saunas and log cabins, very evocative of the forest. And the actual body of the tea, it's quite full-bodied, sweet, and almost has a kind of thick, juicy type texture to it. I think if you add that cambium inner bark layer as well, you get a bit more of those kind of starchy sugars coming out. And if you harvest those in the summer, you'll have even higher sugar content as all the nutrients are rushing into the tree. So please, next time you're in the forest, or out and about camping, hiking, why not select a few pine needles, spruce or fir, and try and make a tea of your own. Cheers.